so much for that very gracious introduction. I've spoken to about 50 or 60 crowds in my life, but actually never in the state of Connecticut, much less West Hartford, where I'm from and grew up. And in keeping with the spirit of the introduction, my background is a bit of a mosaic, and I see that this crowd is a bit of a mosaic. I know we've got businessmen, physicians, philosophers, we've got people who are at the end or in the middle of their careers, and people at the beginning of their careers. I'm going to try, so that's a challenge for me, at what level should I try to pitch everything. I have a special eye towards this left side of the room here. There are 4 students. I was in all 4 of your shoes once upon a time. And my sense was there should be a percentage. I'm not sure exactly what that percentage is, but a larger percentage of what you get, but a good residual remainder that you don't quite get, represents areas for further inquiry. So if there's anything that you're wondering about, both in terms of clarification or how could that guy think something so ridiculous, ask me, press me. And on that note, I just want to say the genesis for this talk, which I wrote for tonight. I'm always thinking about new things, and I like actually to put together talks. And these slides are mostly new. A couple of them I've used before. But I've just finished this book, as David Barrett mentioned, called 4 Models of Moral Evil. And in that book, I actually favor, though not compellingly so, but I slightly favor one of the 4 models over the other 3. I'll say what they are in a moment. But this talk tonight is told from the perspective of someone who's actually read that book and shakes his head and said, I don't know what the guy's talking about. He gave the first model short shrift, and he needs to rethink things. And part of that rethinking is in light of some very recent evidence that's come to light. So I stand here before you criticizing the work that's not even yet published, and that should make for some fun. And finally, I just want to say, I already alluded to it, it's really nice to actually speak in the Nutmeg State where I'm from, and this is just a personal thing that hadn't been done before tonight, so I'm happy it is now happening. So let me give you a brief blueprint for what I'm going to discuss tonight. Again, second apology in advance. At times it will get complicated. It deals with neurology, it deals a little bit with psychology, it deals a lot with philosophy, a little bit with theology. No one gets any special treatment. People from all disciplines get a nod. And again, there'll be time for clarification. So I'm going to introduce these 4 models. I'm going to raise an objection on behalf of one of the models against a standard assumption about the other 3 models, and frankly a standard assumption about evil in general, about the nature of evil. I'm going to explain this objection by referring to some recent findings in neurology and psychology, analyze these findings, and talk about what the consequences are for our way of normally assessing praiseworthiness and blameworthiness with regard to moral agency, and talk about what I regard to be an asymmetry in terms of how we regard goodness and how we regard evil. The standard assumptions apply usually both to goodness and evil. We blame people and praise people according to the good and bad things that they do, according to the same kind of mechanism. I'm going to argue that we should actually keep the current standard mechanism with regard to good, but revise maybe the way we think about evil. And finally, I'm going to talk about the upshot of all of this for moral psychology, basically, and mention some things like determinism and whether or not Satan is acting in the world. Okay, so what does all that mean? Now I'll get specific and try to say things in a way that you actually understand it. Let me begin by introducing you the 4 moral models that I talk about in the book, and I think you'll get them. So the first is the topic of tonight. It's what I call the Manichean model. The Manichean model is the idea of evil versus goodness. These 2 warring parties, they're opposites. It's sometimes referred to as dualism. And in the Manichean view, evil is the monstrous other. It's the unrecognizable other that threatens to do our way of life from the outside. A wonderful book, one of the first novels ever written, called Beowulf, talks about a monster that comes and terrorizes a village. The monster's never really fully penetrated. This would be an example of the Manichean Gothic view of evil. Here, evil is the predictable consequence of some, for lack of a better term right now, we'll call it satanic influence in the world. You can vanquish evil, and you can flee from it when you encounter it, but you can't alter it. It doesn't lead to the good at some subsequent time. It remains its own independent entity. In a moment, I'll get a little bit into the Manichean tradition and why it's called Manicheanism and referred to Manichean. But that's basically the first view of evil. Evil versus the good, okay? They're opposed. The second view I discussed in the book, some religious studies scholars in our group of folks down there in the back left will probably know this term, theodicy, the theodicist view, that basically evil is a step along the way to the good, that evil leads to goodness, that evil is really the good in disguise. So it's not the presence of badness, it's actually the presence of goodness, even though it doesn't really look that way. Evil already is the good, we just lack the full panoramic perspective from which to see this. Theologically described, this means that God doesn't look like God, that we can't recognize God when we encounter God, but that, if we just wait either to the end of this life or the next, we will see God. And there are secular versions of this as well. The idea of a blessing in disguise is a theodicy. The idea of what comes around goes around is a theodicy. The idea of redemption, even after suffering, is a theodicy. So, as opposed to the idea that evil and good stand as opposites, here they are basically the same thing. One is the other manifest. The third idea, so we've got now evil is the presence of badness, evil as the presence of goodness. The third idea, the third model I dub as evil, is basically the absence of badness. There's no set standard for defining evil in the first place. It's a label, it's a perspective from which we can rest ourselves with the right sort of self-reinvention. It's an arbitrary designation, and here I have principally in mind Nietzsche, but many others, all of whom are cynical about the definition of evil. Whenever someone uses evil as a term, they're rhetorically using it as a blunt weapon from which to put in place all viors to their power. The evil really is a reflection of somebody in power labeling somebody else so that they can stay in power. Philosophers might sometimes call this a hermeneutic of suspicion. It's a very cynical way of thinking about what evil is to begin with. So I call that in the book the absence of badness, and evil is really just evil in quotes. Of course, that implies also the absence of goodness, or the absence of any term by which the thing in question can be designated. And finally, the fourth model, which in the book I favor, and with which we'll sort of begin in a moment and talk about a traditional assumption that comes from that, is the idea that evil is absence of goodness. And this goes back to St. Augustine, and is technically referred to by Augustine as the privation model. Evil is what happens, as the secular Augustinian Hannah Arendt called it, a fungus that grows in the dark in lieu of light. It's all the little invisible things that happen along the way as we let our character wane. It's not the presence of something monstrous, it's the absence of all the good things that we could be doing, that if we were to do them, and we were to be vigilant about our character, we become the kind of virtuous person that we would know what the right thing to do is. So, just to now phrase them all in pithy form, evil as the presence of badness, evil as the presence of goodness, evil as the absence of badness, and evil as the absence of goodness. And in the book, I favor the idea of thinking about evil as the absence of goodness. I think a lot of monstrosities from the 20th century, even genocide, can best be accounted for not by looking at evil as an instance of one or two charismatic evildoers that were able to wreak a lot of havoc, but all the bystanders who stood idly by and didn't do the little things that they could have done. And my first book, here, Saints and Ordinary Morality, I talk about that phenomenon of what it would have taken to just do the little things to make, to prevent on the aggregate level evil from happening. But, even though I come out in favor of that view in the book, it's occurred to me with some of the research I've encountered recently, and I do mention some of this in the book, some of it's come out since the book's been submitted to press, that I've given maybe too much, I've overlooked too easily that first model, the Manichean model. The idea, whether you call it Satan or not, but the idea of psychopaths simply being people to whom you can just not get through. Wonderful movie. I think it's one of the only movies ever to have deserved the Best Picture that it won for the Academy Award was No Country for Old Men. And for those of you who saw, how many did see this movie? A little show of hands. Okay, it's a little less than half of you. I recommend it to everyone. But the character who represents evil in that movie, Anton Chigurh, was played by Javier Bardem. To my mind, is the most chilling character ever depicted in a movie. And he's chilling because no matter what you do as any character that interacts with this human monster, even those who understand his world don't get through to him at all. He's very, very intelligent, and he's very able to effectuate prudential reasoning. He's very able to get to A to B and see if there's a problem. But he's not able to care about people. There's just something missing. There's something black. There's something vacant. And I'm more persuaded than I used to be that it is a vain futility to try to get through to these sorts of people in the world, and that moreover, they're more responsible for evil in general than we might have thought. Now, what that means, lots of debates, lots of tributaries that run from those rivers. But before I return to the psychopath and talk about some evidence for what makes the psychopath a psychopath, let me now talk about the tradition of Manicheanism and mention why I call it that, so we know the model that's now being given a second hearing here. So, according to the Manichean model, nothing happens by accident. Everything, every little teeny tiny thing, is part of a cosmic drama that's playing out. And basically, in one way or another, and this refers to well-known Calvinistic Christian theology, we're part of the saved or the damned. We're playing some role, but ultimately we're in one camp or another. Now, Manicheanism was the successor, the natural successor of the Gnostic tradition, and Gnosis literally refers to a mystical enlightenment that could save one from the grip of the king of darkness. This was, around, 2,000 years ago, where Gnosticism was taking hold. And founded by the prophet Mani, who lived 210 to 276 in the Common Era, Manicheanism sort of began in Persia and spread at a rapid rate, both east and west, incorporating a Christian emphasis on spiritual redemption, but also borrowing from Buddhism this idea of transmigration of the souls, which refers to being reborn again until you get it right. Point being, you either got it right or you didn't. You're either saved or you're not. You're either going to ascend into heaven or you're going to have to do it again. But the new introduction, the new innovation of Manicheanism was that there was an independent entity, okay, a god, if you will, as opposed to the God of goodness, that was responsible for everything that went wrong in the world, that was responsible for every reinstantiation of an individual still being born poorly, that was responsible for all the minions of people who were also wreaking havoc. So this, of course, introduced a problem because it implied that God is not omnipotent. God is not, as is in the case of theodicy, the second model, a subsuming, overarching figure where good and evil are really all part of a larger goodness. Rather, there's two independent forces. They have their own gravitational pull, and there's this conflict between spiritual goodness and material, concrete darkness. And the former is constantly under attack by the latter. And there'll be little battles, and you can vanquish evil as it appears in this or that instance, but you can never get rid of it altogether. You can either run away from it, get rid of it in this or that instance, but it's never going to mutate or it's never going to reveal itself in some revelatory event as something larger than what it is. And so the story of Manichean theology and cosmogony, which means an explanation for how things came to be, is that basically Satan ascends to infamy as embodied in concrete darkness. Satan is powerful, Satan is infectious, his influence is durable and irredeemable, and basically he's the epitome of evil. We should be afraid of what Satan might do. Let's get this to work. I don't know if I turned it on yet. I slides today. Maybe that will work. Sorry. Put the green button on. Oh, I was pressing it. Got it. Okay, great. Thank you. So I have up here the etymology of the term Satan. In Hebrew, hasatan means opposer, that's the noun. The verb satan means to resist or to be an adversary or to obstruct. It's used 6 times, actually in the Torah. For instance, in the Psalm 38:20, where it reads, "They oppose me because good follows me." Satan was never anything more than, in its verbal form, a colloquial verb, or in its noun form, a non-proper noun. And that morphed into a proper noun, as you can see by my third bullet point. There's a guy, if you're interested in this, named Jeffrey Burton Russell, who wrote a book called The Devil: Perceptions of Evil from Antiquity to Primitive Christianity. And he traces the development from Satan as a non-proper noun that simply referred to a threatening human opponent to the currently accepted sense of him as an accusing, obstructing divinity conveyed in the apocalyptic texts. And as a lot of scholars have remarked, this was a deliberate attempt to, gear people up for some forthcoming battle that was, germane to the specific time in which the term was being invoked. And it really didn't get taken seriously in Christianity until the Book of Revelation itself was authored. There's controversy as to when it was actually authored, but until itself was, the Book of Revelation itself was started taken seriously. And the Book of Revelation describes the rapture. The rapture is described in 1 Thessalonians 4:15 to 17, and John 14:2 to 3, and elsewhere. But it refers to that instance in which St. Paul anticipates the Lord's assurance of the secret second arrival of Jesus to collect those that have been loyal to him. Jesus' return will be glorious, followed by mayhem on earth. As the saved are escorted up to heaven, the world they leave behind is plunged into chaos. Cars and airplanes crash. You can imagine this. Buildings will crumble. People search in vain for their loved ones, hoping that they're also part of the saved and not part of the damned. And over a period, usually 7 years, is called the period of tribulation. There's lots of different camps that characterize how long this period is. The world suffers plague and famine. And a dictator, the Antichrist, emerges as the world leader and tortures, as a world leader tortures and kills those who oppose him. At last, Jesus Christ comes again. This time he comes in glory, defeats the Antichrist, and reigns over earth. That's roughly the story summarized for what happens in the Book of Revelation. A very colorful, descriptive portion of the New Testament. 2 good references, by the way, for people interested in the Book of Revelation. One is Amy Johnson Freichelm, who's a professor of literature and cultural studies, and she wrote a book called The Rapture Culture, talking about the very popular Left Behind series that sold over 50 million copies in this country so far, that basically is a popularized version of the Book of Revelation. And then the second, I just met Elaine Pagels, who's at Princeton, and she talks about the Book of Revelation as an example of this wartime literature. But I mention it all right now because it really reinforces this idea of evil as an immutable entity that is engaged in some drama. It's not anything other than exactly that it appears to be. And there are a lot of Christian theologians, contemporary Christian theologians, who see something, for example, like Columbine, and they are not happy with what they regard to be the politically correct, facile interpretation of what happened at Columbine, which is basically some wayward teenagers influenced by their goth culture who had access to guns. And, that equation leads to a crisis in the school, a tragedy, a terrible tragedy in the school. For them, it's a much simpler thing going on. That, yes, they grant that there was, videos that made them disposed to be violent. They grant the access to guns. But for this is just people susceptible to Satan's influence. Satan discovers these folks and then they do Satan's work. That's basically the book of Revelation, if you will. I'm simplifying here, but that's basically the book of Revelation. It's basically the first model of evil as an explanatory account for what happened in Columbine and what happens all over the world when people do terrible things. There's nothing accidental about it at all. There's not mistakes made on the part of human agency. There's not even a failure to think. What there is simply the witnessing of something that, if we had the full perspective, would be an obvious type of thing. So by this account, the regular watching of violent videos don't cause the action. They simply make the actors involved ready targets for, I have another slide. They simply make the actors ready targets for a cosmic drama that's already playing out. So that's a very rushed account of the Manichean view, emphasized in the Book of Revelation and promulgated by those theologians who take the Book of Revelation seriously. I now, though, in the bulk of this talk, I want to slow down and start to move back from theology to the real world and talk about what evidence, if any, is there for this idea that evil is not really, in a nutshell, a matter of personal responsibility. It's not a matter of poor decisions, either mistakes or the result of terrible commission of wrongdoing, premeditated, deliberate, terrible commission of wrongdoing, but rather the predictable outcome of human beings who are basically functioning according to how their brains allow them to function. And I'm talking about, proverbial evildoers here. So that's what's at stake. And before we talk about how the Manichean view will undo the traditional view, it might make a little sense to talk about what this traditional view is. So this is one of my favorite paintings. It's in the Louvre, 1635, Guido Rene, and that's the Archangel Michael. So I mentioned theodicy, the second view of evil. And here, evil's not gratuitous, it's purposeful, right? And evil's not ultimate, it's only penultimate. It seems like there is a terrible thing about to happen, but if we were to wait longer and have enough wisdom, we'd see the place of everything. And here, that's the Archangel Michael with his foot on Satan's neck. And the idea being conveyed here is that we are better off in the world with Satan so long as we have Satan contained. In my book, I call this, I coined a term, I call this the containment thesis. The idea that evil has its place, that the world is richer for the sake of evil. C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite evangelical thinkers, in a wonderful account called The Grief Observed, which is about the death of his wife, Joy Davidman, the American poet, talks about how he wouldn't know that this is depicted wonderfully in the movie Shallow-Lands, by the way, starring Anthony Hopkins. He wouldn't know the pleasure of his wife were he not in a position to experience the pain of losing her. And this is a hard thing for him to come to terms with. Now, on this painting, we were talking about, I was talking about William James with some of the University of Hartford students. William James refers to this painting in the varieties of religious experience. And I'm just going to read you a quote from him. I love this quote. In the Louvre, there's a picture by Guido Rene of St. Michael with his foot on Satan's neck. The richness of the picture is in large part due to a fiend's figure being there. The richness of its allegorical meaning is also due to his being there. That is, the world is all the richer for having a devil in it, so long as we keep our foot on his neck. And James goes on to define religion's secret. He calls religion's secret is the ability for it to for us to be individuals who can say that evil is to be permanently overcome. That's what religion furnishes us with. The ability to be individuals for whom it's possible that evil can become permanently overcome. This is a classic theodicy. It's a classic example of how evil seems to be a train wreck, but in reality, everything's happening for a reason. A number of people like James Leibniz, who was the person that coined the term theodicy, C.S. Lewis, who I mentioned earlier, opposing other folks like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, who you folks are reading, cynics, who thought that in the end it was more bad than good. So the idea here is that we are better off in the world that we have evil. We are better off that there is evil in the world. Now, it's not just William James, but probably the most important moral philosopher of the West, Immanuel Kant, the only other rival being Aristotle, I would say. Kant, too, although he didn't subscribe to theodicy, he didn't think that the evil that we experience is a good thing. For Kant, it always remained a mystery. There was too much suffering in the world for him to go there, for him to have James' bravado and say, no matter what happens, it's really good in disguise. Kant didn't go there, but he did say, by virtue of moral evil, we have the blessing from God of being able to choose to do the right thing. Thank God for the possibility of evil, because only by virtue of evil do I know that I can actually deliberately choose to do the good. Now, I link Kant to James in this limited respect because for both of them, evil actually makes the human being and human experience more rich and separates us from the animals by just that much more. And basically, according to Kant, maybe not experiential evil, maybe not a tsunami, although in my book I argue that what happened in Fukushima is moral evil and not natural evil. The wave itself is natural evil. The consequences that ensue due to the pressure on us to have nuclear power, that's a little bit more complicated. Subsequent discussion. But Kant is saying that basically when it comes to moral evil, the things that we do, it is within our control. And being within our control, it can be contained in principle. In Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, Kant characterizes evil as the upshot of the habitual corruption of the will, whereby we ultimately substitute a desire to act on inclination for the compulsion to do what's right. And this he calls an inversion of our maxims. Okay, so unlike original sin, which for Kant and most Protestants is inevitable, there's nothing that we can do about that, moral conversion, the overcoming of sin, is within human control. And for Kant, and most moral philosophers follow Kant in this respect, and this is conventional, and our legal system is based on this intuition, moral evil is something that attaches to personal responsibility because there is such a thing as the will. And if there's such a thing as the will, it implies that we can do something about what we're going to do. Now, maybe some people are laboring under certain handicaps that others aren't, but basically, we can penalize people for premeditated wrongful acting because we can infer from their actions what they must have intended. And this is the assumption that is under attack in the Manichean view. So basically, the upshot of what I'm calling the containment thesis, or the Jamesian Kantian view, is an emphasis on fortitude and moral responsibility. Our dignity accrues in proportion to our wherewithal to endure a trial whose advent is beyond our control, but whose duration we have the capacity to outlast and ultimately overcome through sheer perseverance in the case of natural evil and through forming the right dispositions in the case of moral evil. Again, natural evil are the things that happen in this world that have terrible consequences for which there's no human responsibility. Moral evil pertains to the things that we decide to do. And this is what I call the thesis of containment. Okay. So, what evidence, if any, is there for the idea that some people, potentially the worst among us, don't have any will? And so no personal responsibility. And so this calls into question the whole idea that evil may be the good thing that it's presupposed to be in the model of theodicy, and even presupposed to be in the fourth model of evil, where, basically evil is defined by the absence of the good, which is an even more demanding kind of moral ethic, that we have to go out of our way little by little at every moment to try to make ourselves better. It's a strenuous kind of ongoing exercise. In that fourth model, there's no private space into which we can retreat and say to ourselves, okay, I've done my good duty for the day, I haven't hurt anyone. Morality is basically the avoidance of wrongdoing. Leave me alone, I want to watch my TV show right now. You're always on, as it were. It's exhausting. But in both that second and fourth model, there is something at work, it's just a matter of degree that defines the difference, that pertains to this, what I've called the thesis of containment. That basically evil is in the world, but if we act in the right sorts of ways, we're better off for it being in the world, just like we're better off that St. Michael has his foot on Satan's neck. Because we will have known the great strides we've taken to identify ourselves as dignified human beings. Okay, so what evidence is there to suggest this may not be the right way of looking at things? So in the 90s, there was what's known as a TED survey, Twins Early Development Study. This took place in England in 1994, 1995, and 1996. And researchers studied thousands and thousands of identical and fraternal twins born in those years, in which they were trying to determine which traits were influenced by the environment and which traits were inherited. And in 2005, the psychologist S.E. Whiting, I have the reference for you coming up, took a look at these massive findings and surveyed the teachers of 3,687 test twins born between just the years 1994 and 95 regarding their students' character traits. Now, Whiting had long wondered, it had bothered her, she had some personal background here, and my couple friends from elementary school and junior high school who are here today will appreciate this. What it was about those kids you just couldn't get through. There was just pure blackness in their eyes, right? They were just, beyond being delinquent mischief makers, there was something just wrong with them. And Whiting thought, you know what, this is not environment. This is not a matter of poor nourishment. This is not a matter of parental neglect. These kids, under any set of circumstances, would have turned out this way no matter what. I can think of a few going back to KP Middle School, and I'm sure that some of you can think of people who might fit that bill from your pasts. So she was very interested in not merely antisocial behavior, which is a much broader phenomenon, but what she identifies as callous, unemotional behavior, which specifically refers to psychopathy. Not mere sociopathy, but psychopathy. So psychopathy is a species of the larger genus of sociopathy. And she took a look at this TED study, looked at those nearly 3,700 pairs of twins, and from them identified 187 pairs of twins, okay, 187 pairs of twins, who, one of whom at least demonstrated not merely this antisocial tendency, but also this psychopathic, specifically callous, unemotional tendencies. And then an additional 177 who were sociopathic, but not in that specific sense, not in that more extreme sense. So 187 pairs here, 177 pairs there. And she discovered, through parsing fraternal and identical, and specifically looking at the identical twins who grew up in completely unrelated places, some orphan twins, okay, and some adopted twins, that, believe it or not, 81% of all those twins where one person had the more extreme version of sociopathy, well, they were likely to have it in the other case, and as opposed to a 30% for the more mild case. So 81% heritable in one case, 30% heritable in the other case. And from that she concluded that the kids in the former case had a marked tendency towards evil. Now, I've only established through this longitudinal study, or through the reporting of this longitudinal study, correlation, not causation. I'm not going to get into how one moves from correlation to causation, but there's a third variable problem that needs to be surmounted. There's a directional problem that needs to be surmounted. But there's something to look at here. And in other words, while environmental conditions were largely responsible for antisocial behavior, it seems to be that our conclusion is leading towards genetic conditions were responsible for the worst form of antisocial behavior, namely antisocial behavior that was also psychopathic, and that refers to callousness, emotionlessness, guiltlessness, and in some cases use of charm to achieve prudential ends. Here are the two citations I just want to give you that discuss these longitudinal studies. One of them deals with 7-year-olds, the other one deals with 3-year-olds. They watch them, throughout a number of years. striking stuff. And findings showed that minimal shared environmental factors on callous and emotional traits were detected in the case of those, for whom socioeconomic conditions were in play. But when it came to the callous, unemotional, quote-unquote psychopathic traits, none of those things seemed to make that much of a difference. Okay, I have some more there, but I think I will move on. By the way, another wonderful citation that discusses this in other maybe it's one of the 2 books, if I were to tell you to read from this article, from this talk tonight to write down and go check out, is a book called Evil Genes by a woman named Barbara Oakley, O-A-K-L-E-Y. And she discusses these 2 studies as well as several others. Now, there's a guy named, a neuroscientist at Yale, a guy named Kent Keel, who was interested in these findings early on, before Whiting did her study. So he was already publishing stuff along these lines in 2001, but his big article came out called Evidence for Paralimbic System Dysfunction in 2006 on the heels of Whiting's article. And this was discussed in a wonderful article by John Seelig from the New Yorker called Suffering Souls. This wasn't that long ago. And what Keel did was he studied the brains of criminals in Western New Mexico Correctional Facility. He would give, promises. You can have your brain study. We'll give you these charts. Prisoners, he bribed prisoners with, certain privileges that were, sanctioned by the warden. And they basically volunteered themselves, these, the most violent prisoners in this correctional facility, to answer 40 questions. These 40 questions were designed to determine 2 things. What is the moral reasoning capability among these folks? And what's their emotional response to the questions being asked? Moral reasoning tends to occur in the frontal lobe. Emotional intelligence, it's thought to be the paralimbic region, and specifically the amygdala, which is an almond-shaped portion of the brain in the middle brain, the paralimbic region. And what he discovered was that when these questions were being asked, and some of them were sort of mild questions, what would you do in such and such a scenario, to try to garner a response of guilt or a response of how you feel about, this sort of difficult situation. Would you ever betray this person? Would you kill that person? And then some were more graphic in nature, referred to even taboo sorts of acts. What they discovered through fMRI technology is that in the frontal lobes, there was a lot of activity going on. The frontal lobes were, in some cases, the frontal lobes were even doing a better job than the normal population. But in the paralimbic region, not so much. Now, my brother-in-law, who's here as a radiologist, could probably explain this a lot better than me, but I'll give it a shot. My understanding of how fMRIs work is that when neurons in the brain work, they basically need to be replenished by hemoglobin, by blood. When your brain is working, it needs to be replenished by blood, and that blood contains iron-rich hemoglobin. And fMRIs take these cross-sectional shots as the blood's returning to those portions of the brain that are being used, and you can tell which regions of the brain are in use. That's a very crude, I'm sure I'll be corrected later, but that's a very crude account of how fMRIs work. But what fMRIs enable you to do is to discover which parts of the body are in use during which kinds of activities. And what they discovered in these very worst criminals is that there was nothing much going on in the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for emotional processing. So now imagine this. You have a whole bunch of people being asked questions who know what the right answers are supposed to be. If this is a driving test, they're going to get the multiple choice part of it very, very well. But for them, there's nothing much at stake in the answers to those questions. The answers that they're getting right are of no use to them because they can't be applied because there's something lacking motivationally. Philosophically, they're intact. Motivationally, they're deficient. Now, this is interesting because Kant has been criticized not for having a weak moral philosophy, but for having a weak moral psychology. So what if the categorical imperative, which tells you it's basically a secular version of the golden rule, each time you do something, you're to will the person who's standing in your shoes, if they were to be standing in your shoes, to do the exact same thing, right? Never make of your own case an exception. Well, that leads to a pretty, fail-safe method of determining whether or not you're being selfish when you do something. Fine, you get the right answer, you just don't act on it because you don't care. The amygdala is the part of the brain that's responsible for caring. Now, the frontal lobe can be instructive for guiding the amygdala to try to work on these things, right? If you know you're deficient in a certain respect, if you know you want to work, you want to get in shape, you can guide yourself to work out at the gym. You can put yourself in a situation to optimally effectuate the amygdala. So, what good is Kantian philosophy that, says this critic, that focuses on moral responsibility if there's not the moral motivation to get it going? And how useful is a moral theory if it doesn't apply to the worst among us? That is an issue. In response to some of this research, and I urge you to look this up. I think it's November, this is from memory, but November 2008 from the New Yorker, easily accessible online. By the way, that term suffering souls, I think was coined by a French surgeon, Philippe Pinet, in 1801, and he introduces this term mania without delirium, and literally suffering souls, and he argued that these people literally live in hell. The psychologist Adrian Rain notes, in response to this is a quote, "Free will exists on a continuum with some people having almost complete freedom in their actions while others have little freedom of will to none." And that's in Oakley, and I also have, for those of you who are interested, the reference for that. So this leads to a bit of a conundrum. This is actually nothing that new. Aristotle noticed this in his most important work, the Manichean Ethics. Oh, those are, if I go backwards here. Yes, okay, so I'm sorry. I turned this right. This is just a slide of one of Keel's slides to describe the defective brains or what's going on in the amygdalas, and I don't have enough of an understanding of what this all means to be able to explain it to you any more intelligibly than I just did. But lots of people are working on this right now. And this comes from the Manichean Ethics. This is a quote from Aristotle, Irwin's translation. "Someone might raise this puzzle. What do you mean by saying that to become just, we must first do just actions, and that to become temperate, we must first do temperate actions? For if what we do is just or temperate, must not we already be just or temperate? Don't you have to have a little bit of moral insight in order to have enough activation energy to become more insightful? And if you're lacking it altogether, there's not much you can do." Aristotle was actually fairly pessimistic on this question. He thought that the virtuous and the non-virtuous had not much to say to each other. Aristotle divided friends into three general types. The weakest type were what he called friends of utility. People who you need to get what you want in society. You enter into manufactured relationships that advance the frontiers of your sphere of influence and power, but you don't really care so much about those people. Then there are friendships of pleasure. Basically, friendship is reduced to just having a good time, but at least it's genuine. And then finally, philia, true philia, was friendships of character, where people who display certain characteristics that you yourself have, and that can be worked on in exposure and proximity to them, and vice versa, those are the only true friends worth having. And he thought that most people, he actually was quite pessimistic, most people didn't get much beyond friendships of utility, let alone friendships of pleasure. And that, therefore, it was a futile endeavor to try to reach out to someone who lacked, enough requisite virtue in the first place to make them more virtuous. One of my favorite thinkers, Alistair McIntyre, wrote a book called Rational Dependent Animals, where he talks about actually the importance of parenting and trying to get what little there is with some of these problem cases and make the most of it. But in the end, you're sort of dependent on the luck of what one has to begin with. You can see where I'm going with this. And this is a little cute way of putting Aristotle's point more succinctly. And this leads in my book to what I call the good-evil asymmetry. No one's born purely good, that's for sure. Goodness requires very hard work. But some people are born purely evil. And so I think Aristotle is absolutely right about what's mechanistically required to become better. In my second book, The Altruistic Species, I argue that altruism is not a talent. It's not like throwing a baseball at 90-something miles per hour, which no matter how many times I try to do it, I'm going to fail. Or the one time I embarrassingly tried to paint the Duomo at San Marco Square, and then started painting a 4-year-old who, the minute she looked at what I was painting, had tears well up in her eyes and ran to her mom. I mean, I was listening to the Nike commercial, just do it, and bought a few, supplies. Some artists will argue if I practiced hard enough, I may have been able to do that. But certainly there are things in this world that no matter how hard I try, I'm going to fail. Goodness is not one of them. Virtue is not one of them. Caring is not one of them. This is something that if you're in the 99% of people, non-psychopathic, you can do if you work on it. It is exactly like going to the gym. It is a skill. It is not a talent. Now, in 2005, there were 3 Duke University professors at my alma mater, Daryl Tankersley, Jill Stowe, and Scott Hutel. And they published an article called Altruism is Associated with an Increased Neural Response to Agency in Nature and Neuroscience. That was 2007. And they used fMRI technology to show that when you work on becoming better, and they had their own experimental devices to show this, there's a lot of activity in the posterior superior temporal cortex. The part of the brain that actually changes as you work on becoming a more virtuous person. Keel looked at this and discovered that for those who have amygdala problems, Tankersley et al.'s findings don't work in the way that they were predicted to work. That there's something that can actually stop this process. So while for goodness, it is a matter for almost all of us of working on ourselves and becoming better, for this few, for these few people who have these damaged parts of their brains in the paralimbic region, it's all for naught. It's not going to work out. So, what is the upshot of this? How important is this? And I'm going to talk a little bit about now who we're talking about and what we do about this in society. I was getting grilled about this at dinner by my father. So is this something that should worry us? I mean, the normal kinds of presuppositions still apply. I'm not arguing. They still apply to the majority of us. Well, we're talking about people, it turns out, who have callous and unemotional traits, who are also very charismatic, who have an uncanny ability to wield a lot of influence. This is by the theme. In fact, it's the motivation for what got Barbara Oakley to write the book, Evil Genes. Her sister, she thought, was one of these people. Her sister manipulated everyone in their lives, and she claims ruined her life. And so this book it's not payback, it's therapy. That's how she sees it. And just alongside her sister, she talks about Pol Pot, Hitler, Stalin, Idi Amin, the worst of all time. And she discovers that all these people seem to have charm, they seem to be, guilt-free, even though they can feign guilt quite well. They're very effective freeloaders in society. Well, what Keel found is that basically of those people whom he questioned, and then this was conducted on a much larger scale, it's about 23 to 25% of the male prison population, 1 to 3% of males in society. Much lower incidence in the case of females. At least one argument in favor of a fairer sex. So this is minimally, if you do a conservative estimate, about 1.1 million people in this country. So even if we're not talking about the majority, that's still a lot of people. And if these people also have incredible skills, right, their frontal lobes are working even better, right, then we're talking about people who can do damage that's not commensurate with their sheer volume in numbers. It's a lot of people who would not be excused according to the current insanity defense, which is entirely based on cognitive criteria. Did the person know right from wrong? No questions about whether or not they cared about whether or not it was right or wrong. Just that's what the current insanity defense is. Did they know right from wrong? That's a lot of people who arguably can do nothing about their predicament, or very little about their predicament. Some objections to the objections forthcoming. I'll just mention one right now. There's a guy named Henry Frankfurter, who wrote a book called What People Care About, who argues that even if you're subject to this condition, like someone who has Asperger's disease, you can be aware of your predicament and engage in certain behavioral therapy. But that's to be laboring under quite a handicap. That's to be, having many, many more challenges than the average person who has a much easier time because of a well-developed amygdala of not just doing the right thing, but caring about the right thing. And by the way, this is all consistent with the findings of a guy named Bernard Hartford, who in 2007 found that America's higher than average prison population, compared with that of other countries, is inversely related to the low number of involuntary patients we commit to our mental institutions. We do not treat the insanity defense relative to other countries very charitably in this country. And even if we are only talking about a few people, not the 1.1 million people we're at least talking about, but even if it's a very few people, there's a principle here, and that principle is the moral theory that we want to adopt, right, that's encapsulated in the containment thesis, this idea of Kant's that will and personal responsibility are key in determining praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. Wouldn't we want our moral theories to apply to the worst among us? I mean, aren't they the people for whom morality is designed? So the numbers aren't the only thing that matters. There's a principle here that matters as well. And before I get to some conclusions, I'm right on time. Before I get to some conclusions, I just want to refer to, I think I brought the book with me as well, a case from American history that I think is very interesting, just to put a concrete case to the resistance, or historical resistance to the type of thing that I'm suggesting tonight. This is a book by Charles Rosenberg called The Trial of the Assassin Guiteau. Does anyone know, besides anyone I've talked about it with, who Guiteau was?
He assassinated him.
That's right. James Garfield, our 20th president in 1881. 200 days into his presidency. And by all accounts, Garfield was going to be one of the really good ones as well. He was a heady president, he was a doer. He'd make any of the candidates today pretty proud, I think. And this guy who killed him turned out to be a schizophrenic. And I just want to read some accounts from the doctor who was called in his defense, not by the prosecution, was called in his defense, who was being cross-examined, and this was the doctor's own description of him. So this is a guy who's got some problems, not caring about people, but actually determining right from wrong. If you will, the lower standard of insanity, the one that as a country we eventually came to adopt. This was the first insanity trial, actually, I believe. The standard that we eventually came to adopt, but that still it's very hard to find someone guilty of. It's considered to be one of the hardest defenses to pull off. So his Dr. Spitzka, I'm just going to read you some descriptions that I marked this morning here. He was asked by Scoville, the prosecutor, what sort of insanity did the prisoner exhibit if we're going to allow it, if I'm going to allow you to use that term, what do you mean by insanity? What were his characteristic symptoms? I may say, Spitzka replied, that would be very difficult for me to render clear to any jury not composed of experts. I can simply say that the marked feature of this man's insanity is a tendency to delusive or insane opinion, and to the creation of morbid or fantastical projects. That there is a marked element of imbecility of judgment, and while I had no other evidence than the expression of his face, I should have no doubt that he was also a moral imbecile, or rather a moral monstrosity. Someone who is clearly being defined as someone who doesn't function in the right ways. He was, Spitzer continued to his exposition, to use a very good popular term, a brain monstrosity. This comes up a lot in his testimony, brain monstrosity. A congenital malformation of the brain, presumably as far as we are entitled to form an opinion as to what the condition of the brain here is. I mean a person who was born with so defective a nervous organization that he is altogether deprived of that moral sense, which is an integral and essential constituent of the normal human mind. He being analogous in that respect to the congenital cripple who was born speechless, or with one leg shorter than the other, with any other monstrous development that we now and again see.